أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. No Auckland aho, no India and Pakistan oku tipuna, e whānau me oki Sakar, e tōpu ake oki Peshawar, Tokyo and Auckland. Kei Auckland aho e noho ana, ke Khadija Leadership Network and Amnesty International Aotearoa New Zealand, aho e mahi ana, ko Tayyaba Khan toku whenua, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I want to start off by acknowledging Ngāi Tahu for their manakitanga and the survivors and families of victims who've joined us today. And a sincere thanks to DPMC for extending the invitation to be a part of this panel. It is, after all, an act of openness for public service to provide a platform to human rights organizations like the ones I'm representing today. And last but certainly not the least, to my esteemed panelists, I hope our time is beneficial and a starting point to what we have to offer you in relation to this conversation. The 10 minutes I have can't do justice to a topic that requires a conference on its own. We've been asked to comment on a raft of questions in the sessions, from what the key elements of our strategic approach should be, to the role of the government, faith, community, and individuals. Our briefs include sharing thoughts on te tiriti and all this, and human rights, and proportionality as foundations to our strategic approach. And finally, the session is about what is working overseas and what we can learn to apply here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My 10 minutes won't do justice to that, and it is fair to say as a panel, we will simply be skimming the surface on the ideas, challenges, and perspectives to consider, which is why it has been great to have so many speakers before us covering key aspects of our strategic approach that I quickly want to re-emphasize again. This is just the beginning of the conversation, and we need to hold each other to account to keep the conversation going. The need for research, but as Professor Cheryl De La Rey, a woman I deeply admire because of the equity changes she's bringing not only within the University of Canterbury, but within the region, an ally, for many, has said at her welcoming speech, and if you were listening intently to her corridor, it was courageous for her to acknowledge the problems of racism that exist within universities. But most significantly, that researchers who come with their own set of biases and limitations to the work that they are researching, and the need for them to work with communities. As an actively contributing member of the Muslim community in the post-9/11 context, I've gotten to a point where I avoid researchers. They would often research at and not with, and in the decade of my service in the community really represented the communities or ethnicities or faith of the people that they were researching. Diversity amongst researchers remains a challenge, and one we cannot ignore in the countering violence extremism space. Ms. Kittredge and I really see eye to eye, and we know that with the public issues that we often comment on, namely the jihadi brides. But yesterday she mentioned something that I could finally connect with her on, and that was that language is important. Language is critical. Language in countering violence needs to be accessible. In fact, if we are authentic in our intent to be unique in how New Zealand responds to extreme violence, then we should also stop using language imported from the Obama administration era that is now loaded with inadequacies and creates distrust within communities. We need a new language where white supremacy, Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, and concepts are well understood, and then we can engage constructively. As Dr. Lindsay said yesterday, building trust is essential and won't happen if we bring into our context the very interventions that have not worked overseas. Thank you to all the speakers before me who have already given us so much to reflect on, including Juliet Moses yesterday, because she set the foundation for the very first strategic element I want to speak to, that I think is essential to preventing violence. And that is that we can't continue to ignore the long-standing grievances caused by foreign and domestic policies that can be at times the cause of this violence. As global citizens, no longer of one place, one race, one faith, intersectional in our identity, and as New Zealanders, we need to let go of the nostalgia of a singular identity where what happens elsewhere does not affect us. Our reality, especially post-March 15th, suggests that as New Zealanders, we can no longer think that an issue overseas does not affect us. So, for example, yesterday, where we were willing to hear about concerns of anti-Semitism, we should equally be willing to hold space for the hurt felt by the Palestinians and the violence they experience. Amnesty International has recently released a report on the human rights abuses experienced by the Uyghur people. China's position, one of counterterrorism, is an overseas model we're all quickly becoming familiar with. The question we must ask ourselves is whether we ignore the effects of such mass abuses when we have citizens here who have family members in China experiencing that violence. The second strategic element we need to focus on is not repeating the mistakes of our past. The war on terror of the Bush era has left us with an Iraq and an Afghanistan that 2 decades on are barely recognizable by the people that hail from those countries. Add Syria and Yemen in the mix, and we have seen legal interventions introduced as blanket measures in the UK, US, Australia, and now New Zealand, like passport revocations and control orders to respond to the issues of foreign fighters. In the framework of human rights, there is a recognition that a major role of the state is to protect its citizens. But what we have noticed in the New Zealand context is a reactionary response to introducing legislative measures that have not allowed us to fully interrogate the impact of these legislative instruments on one's human rights and our obligations to international conventions we're signatories to. As you can tell, I'm a little bit nervous. Amnesty International Aotearoa, New Zealand, raised these concerns in 2014 in the submission on the Countering Terrorist Fighters Bill. Actually, at this point, I want to stop and acknowledge two ko-matua of the Muslim community, Dr. Anwar Ghani and Rehana Ali. When the CTF bill was being rushed through here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I actually flew down to Wellington to listen to the oral submissions of the Federation of Islamic Association and the Islamic Women's Council, represented by Dr. Anwar Ghani and Rehana Ali. And I will not forget the moment when you, Dr. Ghani, when you broke down, and the vulnerability of seeing leaders you've grown up around fight in the midst of a tidal wave of legislative instruments that are foreign to our makeup and that seem very scary. And if you know Rehana at all, she handles herself with grace and patience, and it was the very first time I think I saw a frown line and frustration that I'd never seen before. I come from a community that's been fighting the struggle for a very, very long time, so these conversations are not easy, and hearing the voices of the people in this community are critical, not just for the Muslims, but the impact that they blanketly have on many, many communities. I can think of the Sikh community, for example, in France, and what's happening with religious symbols, but also religious attire in places like the EU. If we want to be strategic, we need to rethink being reactionary. Human rights, fair trials, due processes don't have to be mutually exclusive. So as we move forward, we need the government to allow for sufficient time to consider a new way forward. I unfortunately don't have the sufficient time to discuss the dangers of legal mechanisms now in place, such as secret evidence, control orders, to name a few. but there is enough data from overseas countries of these legislative mechanisms that allow for us to think about what that would mean for us in New Zealand. Which leads me to my final thought on our strategic approach: the ability to empower all facets of society to become digitally and politically literate for the current landscape. We've talked about empowering communities. Let's start with addressing root grievances, countering disenfranchisement and alienation, and reviewing our policy architecture. Let's look at unique and often unspoken nations like Denmark and their innovative rehabilitation programs for those returning from Syria as but one of the many examples of healthier, safer, and restorative responses towards healing our world from violence. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Your turn, please.
Thank you. I just want to appreciate this kaupapa and this mahi in this conference. I've been involved in restorative justice work for about 20 years, and there were several recommendations out of the Commission report that were relating to restorative justice. And my experience in the U.S., in the Philippines, and here, and just as a caveat, we understand that restorative justice, or RJ, is something that was really established or thought up by people like me when they realized that the criminal justice system had really screwed up and had left too many people, particularly people of color, incarcerated in cyclical patterns. But I wanted to, and I've noticed that RJ has evolved over the years from something very personalized and in sort of about two people perhaps to encompass what some call a restorative justice social movement. But what I would like to understand is, how will restorative justice or restorative approaches be incorporated into this, into New Zealand's strategic response? Because that's what this panel is about, the strategic response. And I know, Andrew, we were table of partners last night, and I asked you this question, but I would like to also ask the other panels, recognizing that RJ is not a silver bullet to solve all problems, and it is not the same as Indigenous justice or Māori justice. Those are also different things, but we found alliances in working towards these goals of repairing harm, and that word harm seems to keep coming up. But is there an approach to dealing with it that goes beyond just moderating harmful content, removing it, for example, from the internet? That doesn't necessarily mean that the impact of that content has adequately been addressed and redressed and restored if it can be done. So I want to put that out to the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So look, my experience is predominantly based in the UK. I work for an organisation called Caged Prisoners, which was founded right after 9/11, with people that were being taken into Guantanamo, and currently the organisation is run by some of the guys who came out of Guantanamo. They weren't charged; they were just held in Guantanamo and tortured for several years. They got a payout, great, but their lives were destroyed as a result of it. And so Cage formed itself to really advocate against war on terror policies and its impact on the Muslims around the world. That's what the organisation does. So some of the things that I guess I will speak to in terms of what would peripherally relate to restorative justice is that we need to, what I was saying in my speech, look at the root causes. If we're not addressing the root causes of someone's grievance, well, then we're not addressing the issue. We're simply putting a Band-Aid on it. And we're also securitizing social issues when we should be addressing those social issues rather than securitizing it with, national security, legal instruments that are actually quite harmful, like control orders. I know someone who's actually had a control order in the UK imposed on them for simple things like whatever they tweet online, and if they're actually expressing their political position on something that might not be the state's position that the state wants to hear. Those are the things that cause long-standing grievance. Those are the things that cause violence at times. And so I go back to really going to the root cause of what the issues are, and we do that in restorative ways. That's where I think engaging with Māori is critical, and actually having Te Ao Māori frameworks and how we're responding to this whole countering violence extremism is important. Changing the language of it to reflect who we are is really important. Those would be some of the things I think I would say are really critical for us to think about. We haven't had the opportunity to have this discussion, so this is possibly the first time even I've engaged in a space like this. We need more of that, and we need to actually simplify it, like Whainolene said, with language that people understand, Once language becomes really technical or clinical, that's it. We've lost the people who it affects the most. Those are the things I think that are very simple strategies that we should all be looking into as part of the restorative process.
Just in the interest of time, I know that there could be more said by the panel, but could I perhaps encourage the person who asked the question to talk to one of the panel during the break, and we'll just take the final question before lunch.
It's more of a comment cure, everyone, and thank you, Tayyaba. Basically, this is more of a comment, and thank you for that. You mentioned the issues that the Sikhs had in France. My heart goes out to every person who lost their family and friends, and salam alaikum, and basically I feel for you, but we as turban-wearing Sikhs face equal amount of discrimination, racial abuse, and bullying at schools, education sector, workplace, in our day-to-day lives. You're the only person since yesterday morning, the only panelist who mentioned Sikhs. So I am fully thankful, very much grateful for you to bring that up, because even though I understand what are we here for, you pointing out the comments, because we as a turban-wearing Sikhs, we are pretty much on the same boat as a hijab-wearing woman, because we are discriminated because of our looks. So we are called different names, different things. You mentioned that, and I couldn't be thankful to you. Thank you so much for that.